Okay, let's get started. Hi, I'm Herb Jackson. I'm the politics editor at CQ Roll Call, and thanks for logging on to today's At the Races webinar. We're going to focus on the House and Senate contests that are going to decide party control for the next 2 years. Today, I'm joined by our campaigns and elections team, which is Kate Ackley, Stephanie Aiken, and Bridget Bowman. And between them, they are watching about 100 races or nearly 100 races around the country, and they produce the weekly At the Races newsletter, which you can get every Thursday. It should be out by about the time we finish this webinar by subscribing at rollcall.com/newsletters. Today, we're going to talk about the key races and try to answer any questions you have. If you want to ask questions, use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will keep an eye out for them while everybody's talking. So we're going to start with the Senate. Right now, the Republicans have a 53-47 margin in the Senate. That means the Democrats need to pick up a net 4 seats to get the majority. They can also take control if they pick up a net 3 seats and Joe Biden wins the White House because the vice president breaks ties and Kamala Harris would be the vice president, and there would be 50-50 senators once she gets replaced in California. Our elections analyst, Nathan Gonzalez, who's going to be with us for a webinar in 2 weeks, says signs are good for a Senate takeover, but which seats flip and who survive, there's a lot of uncertainty about that. We also have to keep in mind that the Democrats can add to their numbers, but before they do that, they probably have to replace one of their current members who's a heavy underdog. And I'm going to let Bridget talk to you about that.
Yeah, thanks, Herb. So the battle for the Senate, from party strategists that all of us have been talking to, it's expected to be really, really close, really tight. And Herb mentioned Alabama. It was referencing Alabama Democratic Senator Doug Jones, who's looking really vulnerable. So when we're kind of doing the math in our heads of what the outcome's going to look like, we kind of maybe have to assume that Democrats are going to lose that seat. We regularly do rankings of the 10 most vulnerable senators and 10 most vulnerable House members. And we've actually had the same 5 senators at the top of our top 10 list for the whole cycle, which shows you even in this crazy year that we've had, the Senate race battleground has been kind of stable. So those top 5 include Jones and then 4 Republican senators. So that's Colorado's Cory Gardner, Arizona's Martha McSally, North Carolina's Tom Tillis, and Maine's Susan Collins. And even though this has been kind of a stable, I say stable election-wise in terms of what races are competitive, obviously this has been a very unstable year. But there have been some surprises in these races too. And I know Kate's been covering North Carolina for us, if you want to talk about some of the most recent news there.
Yeah, we did have a couple October surprises in the North Carolina Senate race, which is one of the most hotly watched and most expensive races in the country. And so the news late last week, was that the incumbent, Senator Tom Tillis, tested positive for COVID-19 after attending an event at the White House unveiling the Supreme Court nominee. And then that news sort of got eclipsed when his challenger, Democrat Cal Cunningham, who has been running ahead in the polls, basically apologized for an extramarital affair. And that has really been dominating the news cycle in North Carolina amid as voters are already casting ballots there. So Democrats are looking for other pickup opportunities as well. Montana Senate is a very tight toss-up race, where you have the incumbent governor, a Democrat. His name is Steve Bullock. And then we have the other Steve, incumbent Senator Steve Daines. Stephanie, I think you're watching some of the other races that have really risen up to the top there too. So you want to take it away?
Yeah, sure. So in Georgia, there are 2 Senate races that we're watching. There's one seat where the appointed Senator Kelly Loeffler is going to be in a very crowded race with about 20 candidates. That is almost certainly going to head to a runoff. And up until recently, it was looking possible that the runoff would be between her and a Republican House member, Doug Collins, who have been kind of competing to see who could go the most to the right. But just in recent weeks, we've seen a Democrat really surge ahead in polling. Raphael Warnock, who's a pastor at Martin Luther King Jr.'s former church, who's been doing extremely well in polling and fundraising. So that's making that race very interesting. And there's also in Georgia, incumbent Senator David Perdue is facing a pretty tight challenge from a Democratic former House staffer, John Ossoff, who's also a documentary filmmaker. And one thing that's been a surprise this cycle, I mean, Georgia is a traditionally conservative state, but Democrats have been kind of saying it's going to come online for years, and we've seen increasingly competitive and expensive races there for years, and this is the year that Democrats are saying that they're hoping that could come to fruition. But other states that haven't really been competitive for a while are starting to come into play, and we're seeing that happen in South Carolina with Senator, probably very familiar to everybody, Lindsey Graham, in Kansas, where there's a very tight battle for an open seat left open by retiring Senator Pat Roberts, and in Alaska with Dan Sullivan, who's probably the lesser known of the state's two Republican senators. And then Bridget has been watching some races in Texas and also Iowa that she can tell us about.
Yeah, so it's interesting when we're talking, kind of looking at the big picture of the battle for the Senate. We've got those top 5 races that I mentioned, and then this next tier of Iowa, Montana, Georgia, races that are very close, that if Democrats want to make sure that they definitely have the majority, they're looking to win in that next tier of states. And then we have another, like kind of a third tier of, like Stephanie was mentioning, these traditionally Republican states that are now looking competitive at the presidential level and also in these Senate races. And Texas is one of them as well. Texas is definitely a House battleground this cycle. Senator John Cornyn is facing Air Force veteran MJ Hagar, who just reported or just announced a very big fundraising quarter. Texas is really expensive though. So this is gonna be a race to watch. It's just very expensive to compete in, but it's gonna be one we're gonna be watching really closely on election night.
So where, you know, Republicans have a really dismal Senate map, Bridget mentioned Doug Jones in Alabama as one of their pickup opportunities. They really only have one other solid potential pickup opportunity, and that's in Michigan, where incumbent Democrat Gary Peters has a real race against Republican John James, who's been raising a lot of money. What we're watching in that race is the presidential spending that was a battleground state that Trump won in 2016, but the Trump campaign seems to be pulling back from its spending there. So that's good news for Peters and bad news for his challenger, James.
Right.
So Herb, I think you're
Yep.
taking it next.
Yeah, I tried to take it earlier, so, you know. So the thing we always have to remember is stuff happens that we can't anticipate. And it seems like 500 years ago, but we had this major disruption come in the race a few weeks ago with the death of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. How do we see that playing out across the field?
So both parties see this as something that does benefit them just because it's really firing up both of their bases. For Republicans, there were a few senators who were kind of trailing President Trump in some polling, notably Tom Tillis in North Carolina and Martha McSally in Arizona. So the hope is that a battle of the Supreme Court will help consolidate Republican voters around those Republican senators as well, and making those races closer. I think across the map there has been some tightening, so it's unclear if that's a Supreme Court effect or if that's just a natural Republicans are starting to come home happening. But on the Democratic side, Democrats are also really fired up about this. And that's been evident in just the record numbers of campaign donations that we've seen, particularly flowing to Democratic Senate challengers. Some more than $20 million quarters for some of these candidates, which is just really remarkable going into the final leg of this race. And I know Stephanie, so this obviously puts the Senate Judiciary Chairman in the spotlight, and Stephanie, you've been covering that race as well. If you want to talk a little bit about just how the Supreme Court is playing out in that specific race.
Sure. And one of the races where this is going to be a really big issue is Lindsey Graham's race. And he was already facing a challenge from the former state Democratic Party chairman, Jamie Harrison, who kind of took him by surprise. Harrison hasn't really had a serious challenge for a long time, but it was looking pretty clear that voters there were unhappy with his recent shift on President Trump, who he used to be very critical of and now has become his favorite golfing buddy. Jamie Harrison has been raising crazy money, and recent polls before Ginsburg's death were showing them in a tied race. So Harrison has kind of seized on the opportunity of judiciary hearings to give him a chance to get back in the spotlight, to remind independent, undecided voters in the state that is a conservative state why they want him in the Senate, voting for conservative judges. But it's not really clear how that's going to work out for him. Harrison does still have a tough race. He already has support of the majority of Democrats in that state, so he is going to have to pull over either some undecided voters or find a coalition of voters who haven't historically shown up to the polls among Black voters and young voters who he has some natural inroads in, because he is the first Black chairman of the state Democratic Party there and has a pretty compelling biography. And then Kate also is watching what's going on in the Maine Senate race too, where this has been a big issue.
Right. I mean, this is not a new issue in the Maine Senate race. The incumbent Republican Senator Susan Collins had mobilized a lot of opposition against her for her vote a couple years ago for Justice Kavanaugh. There was a big fund, more than $4 million that people had raised for whoever was her opponent. It's Sarah Gideon, a Democrat from Maine, but they didn't even care who her opponent was. There were people who gave $4 million to oust her because of her vote for Kavanaugh. So even though she has said she doesn't support moving on a confirmation until after the elections, it's just, it's not a good reminder for her voters, and particularly her opposition voters, because the Supreme Court was already a big issue for her there.
Yeah, and remember when $4 million was a lot of money? That was amazing. So we did have a couple questions come in, and I wanted to remind people you could submit questions in your Q&A. There will be a recording of this made available later. The wizards at FiscalNote tell me. One of them is a House race. We're about to get to the House races, so let me go to that, get to that in a second. But Bridget, do you want to say anything about who might replace Kamala Harris in California, or do we just think it's half the population? Anybody who's got an elected office right now.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Andrew, on who's going to replace her in the Senate potentially. It's a pretty long list of folks in California. I think when she was first named the running mate, some names started to circulate as potential replacements. And so I'm watching closely if any of the House members are going to be tapped. I think Adam Schiff is a name that comes up, even maybe Katie Porter. She's been well known for her viral questioning at committee hearings. Any other members of the delegation might be in consideration, like Karen Bass. But at this point, I think it's too soon to tell, but certainly members of the delegation are going to be folks to watch.
All right, and let's talk about the House. What do we need to see a flip there? Is anybody talking about the possibility that Republicans will retake the House, and could the Democrats even expand on the majority that they got in 2018?
Yeah, I think overall Democrats are expected to hold on to their House majority. Even Republicans acknowledge it's kind of an uphill battle for them at this point. As a reminder, Republicans would need a net gain of 17 seats to flip the House. And early on in the cycle, we heard a lot from Republicans that their path to the House majority ran through these 30 districts that President Trump won in 2016, but that are now represented by Democrats. But we've actually seen a number of those Democrats in Trump districts doing pretty well and looking like they could actually hang on this year. Stephanie, I know you've been covering a number of those races, if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. When we started looking at these races at the beginning of the cycle, it looked like there were going to be some obvious pickup opportunities for Republicans in these districts. some of them that Trump carried by pretty large margins in 2018. But as the cycle has gone on, some of the incumbent Democratic freshmen whose races were really the marquee races of the 2018 Democratic wave, like Abigail Spanberger, Mikey Sherrill, Elaine Luria in Virginia, Mikey Sherrill's in New Jersey. We really aren't hearing so much about those races at all. They're still competitive, but they're not really at the top of anybody's lists. And then some of the races that we had pegged as potentially competitive at the beginning of the cycle, when we did our most vulnerable list, we had three Democrats, or we had some Democrats from Trump districts up at the top of the list, but they've, some of those have actually started to fall off our list as well, as it's looking like it's not really sure, nobody's really certain whether they, you know, are gonna, it's looking like they could win, I guess is the way to say it. So like Kendra Horn, for example, was #1 on our most vulnerable list. When we first did the list in the cycle, she fell off when we revised it in August. And that's partly because of big fundraising totals and Trump's declining poll numbers in some of these districts, where even though it looks like he's still ahead in some of them, he's not going to win them by such a big margin, and the Democratic candidates are going to have to overperform. So Kate, do you want to talk a little bit about Democratic fundraising?
Yeah, I mean, and that's been part of the reason that some of these, you know, potentially vulnerable Democrats seem like they're doing okay, is because they have raised huge amounts of money and they have big financial advantages. We've seen, you know, just really record-shattering fundraising reports come in, you know, from House Democrats, some, you know, who have $4, $5+ million in the bank, and really have been able to fend off some serious challenges because of that. You know, and I think even in these final days and weeks of the election, we're seeing still, you know, record-breaking fundraising. So I think that's, you know, and there are Republicans who are also posting big numbers for the third quarter. We have seen that, but you know, there are places that some of these races that you wouldn't necessarily have thought would be competitive in a presidential election year. Montana's open, you know, it has an open seat. So it's, there's the incumbent is actually running for governor. So Kathleen Williams there, Montana, which went for President Trump in 2016 by, you know, 20 some points, is considered part of the House battleground and an opportunity, a pickup opportunity, maybe even for Democrats. So there are all kinds of races all around the country like that, where you see Democrats raising huge piles of money. And then, you know, Stephanie, maybe you want to talk a little bit more about how Trump's doing in the suburbs and what that means for the down ballot folks.
Yeah, sure. You know, we already saw in the midterms in 2018 that Trump was struggling in the suburbs, and a lot of the seats that Democrats flipped in that cycle were suburban districts where, you know, white college educated women, groups that did support Trump in 2016 were starting to sour on him this time around. And we're seeing, in 2018, we're seeing that trend continue now, and the Democratic battleground in the suburbs expanding, particularly in districts that were kind of on the fringes of the Democratic target list in 2018 are now really moving front and center. One of those districts is Nebraska's 2nd district, which we put on the #1 list in our most vulnerable ranking last week, or this week, I'm losing track of time. So in the 2nd district, Don Bacon, he held on in 2018 by 2 points against a Democratic challenger, Kari Eastman, who he said is too liberal for the district. She supported Medicare for all, which could be a potential issue in Nebraska, where the insurance industry is pretty big. But now she's challenging him again, and Democrats are saying she is running a fantastic race. She's learned from her 2018 experience. She's kind of come to the center, and she is getting a boost from attention from the presidential campaigns. Both presidential campaigns have been putting a lot of attention in this district because of the way Nebraska doles out its electoral college votes by congressional district, and the Biden campaign has been pretty active on the ground, and they're expecting to see a boost from that there. But we're seeing a similar trend in other districts held by Republican incumbents, and I think we got a question about John Katko, so we can I'll give that one to Bridget to talk a little bit about that race.
So we got a question in the queue here. Does John Katko in New York pull off a win? For folks who might not be familiar, Congressman Katko represents the 24th district in central New York. I'm from Buffalo, so it's not all upstate New York. There are different regions, that's the whole thing. But in central New York, which is a Syracuse-based district, he was one of 3 Republicans to survive in a Clinton district, a district that Hillary Clinton won in 2016. Almost all the Republicans representing Clinton districts got wiped out in 2018, except for 3, including Congressman Katko. And he is facing the same opponent he faced in 2018, Dana Balter, who, like Carr Eastman that Stephanie was just talking about, is further to the left than some other challengers that we've seen. So Republicans feel really good about Katko. I would say stay tuned to rollcall.com. We've actually got a deeper dive on this coming out soon. Sorry to give that away, Herb. But I think overall, it's really unclear. Republicans feel really good about him, think he's a very strong incumbent, but he is going to have to outrun the president. Biden, people on both sides agree, Biden is expected to win this district. It's just not clear by how much. There was a recent public poll that had Biden winning the district by 19 points and Balter slightly ahead. So if Biden is winning it by that big of a margin, I think it's going to be tough for Katko to pull out a win here. But he's won in tough races before, so this is going to be probably pretty close.
All right, so let me just go through some of the questions. Somebody asked a question about how many mail-in ballots have been returned and counted. There is a website called the U.S. Elections Project where you can see that information. They're doing a running tally. We had a link to it in the At the Races newsletter last week, but right now their data shows about 2.5 million votes have already been cast. You do not get to know how the people are voting. You do get to see in some of those states whether the people who requested ballots are registered Democrats or Republicans, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're voting that way, because in some states you register with one party because that controls your local elections, but you may vote a different way on the federal level. Another question about state legislative races, that is not something we could pretend to tell you about. I'm sorry about that. But Bridget, there's a question about Doug Jones. Why do we consider Doug Jones so vulnerable in Alabama?
So the short answer to that is because he represents Alabama. It's such a Republican state. It's a state that the president carried by 30 points in 2016. And remember, Doug Jones won a very low turnout special election in 2017 against a very flawed Republican nominee in Roy Moore. I would say that Democrats still think he might have a path if he kind of peels off enough Republicans, particularly in the suburban parts of Alabama, who maybe are souring on President Trump. I think just so in a state like Alabama that is so ruby red, it's going to be tough to find enough of those Republicans, I think, who maybe voted for him in 2017. It's just going to be an uphill climb for him. But he does have a significant financial advantage against Tommy Tuberville, the former Auburn University football coach, who he's running against. But even if the president carries Alabama by a lesser margin than he did in 2016, it's still going to be a pretty tough fight for Doug Jones.
Okay, and Kate, you've got Minnesota. We have 2 Minnesota questions. I think you had some plants in the audience. One about Tina Smith and whether she's going to be okay, and could you also talk about the Angie Craig race in Minnesota's 2nd district?
Yes, so we think Senator Smith is fine, but it has been an interesting state to watch, and the Angie Craig district is really strange. A third-party candidate, I think it's the Legalize Marijuana Now Party candidate, sadly died a couple of weeks ago. And so the state has a law that that says if a major party candidate dies within a certain amount of days of the election, then the election is postponed. And so the state officials there said it's postponed until February, which could mean that the district would have no congressional representation early next year. So Congresswoman Craig has mounted a legal challenge to that, which is something we've been watching. You know, it's certainly an unusual situation in that race for sure.
And the other weird thing is, you know, we have this playing out in this concept of, will the House have to decide the presidency in a disputed thing? And that has forced some of the races to look at, some of the parties to look at, where can we flip delegations? Right now, Minnesota is 5-3 Democrat. If you take Craig out of the picture, then it's 4-3 Democrat. And, you know, we could see something change there depending on how things go. Another question here is about Mitch McConnell and whether he'd remain minority leader. I mean, we'd just be guessing on that. We do have a team that covers the House and Senate leadership. I would wonder, you know, whenever we have leadership elections, the one thing we've learned is you can't beat somebody with nobody. Everybody wanted to, you know, there was a lot of people talking about getting rid of Nancy Pelosi at the beginning of last year. Nobody ran against her. So that pretty much solved the problem. So what happens with McConnell, I would see, you know, who's going to run against him for leader? You know, that's the question. That's the answer I give you. And then what about, anybody want to pick up thoughts about possible presidential candidates in 4 years? I thought we'd be sick of an election after this month. But somebody wants to know who's actually thinking of running for president. Maybe you saw one of them last night in the debate against, maybe you saw two of them last night in the debate, depending on how it goes.
Yeah, I think that depends on what happens this November. If Vice President Biden and Senator Harris wins, does Biden run for a second term? If he doesn't, is Harris kind of the expected Democratic nominee at that point? If they don't lose, then what happens? I think, so at this point, the Democratic side's kind of unclear, but we have seen some movement on the Republican side and a lot of chatter, especially around the conventions, which featured Nikki Haley and Senator Tim Scott. Senator Scott has been campaigning with some vulnerable Republican senators, so he might be somebody to watch. Tom Cotton. There's a number of Republican senators who could be looking to make that jump, but yeah, we'll have to see what happens in a couple of weeks.
And now we also have a question here on Arizona CD1 and CD6. Arizona's yours, Bridget.
Yes. Yeah, so CD1, Congressman Tom O'Halloran, this is a Trump district. Trump won it narrowly in 2016. He's running against Tiffany Shedd. I would say I don't think Democrats are super nervous about this one, although there has been some outside spending on the Democratic side. They also spent here in 2018, and O'Halloran still won re-election. So maybe one to keep an eye on, but not one of the top races, I think, that we're watching at this point. And CD6 is Congressman David Schweikert. He got in some trouble for some ethics violations a few months ago, and he's running against Hyrule Tiperneni, whose name might sound familiar to some folks. She ran in a high-profile special election in 2018 in a neighboring district, and she's been consistently a strong fundraiser, outraising Congressman Schweikert. And here in Maricopa County, in these suburbs of Phoenix, is really where Democrats are looking to make some gains, and they think Tiperneni has a really good shot at winning this district. It's been traditionally Republican, but as we've been talking about, the suburbs have been shifting away from President Trump. This is also an area of the state where I'm going to be watching to see how Democrat Mark Kelly does. He's been really trying to appeal to folks in the suburbs as well, these more kind of independent, maybe soft Republican voters. So that's going to be definitely one of the races that we're watching.
Right, and Mark Kelly is the Senate candidate running against Senator Martha McSally.
Yes.
So we'll give Bridget a break and we'll go over to Stephanie because there's a question about Social Taurus Small in New Mexico. I know that we had a lot of discussion about where to place her on our top 10 list in the latest update.
Yeah, that's right. Taurus Small is one of the 30 Democrats in Trump districts that we've been watching all cycle. Her district is one that I think there's consensus on both sides of the aisle that that's one of the toughest districts, if not the toughest district for Democrats to hold on to, just because of the partisan lean of the district. And it's also a district that's been particularly hard hit by job losses due to the COVID epidemic. Taurus Small is someone Democrats are extremely happy with. They say that she's been doing everything right. She's been really focusing on her brand, bringing services back to her constituents. She's been advertising on bipartisan work that she's been doing in Congress, also raising boatloads of money. And the other thing that Democrats will tell you is that they think that her challenger, who is a rematch from 2018, Yvette Harrell, is a weak candidate. So Republicans probably differ with that. But it kind of remains to be seen how that's going to play out. That is, it is a very tough district for Democrats, and nobody thinks that's going to be an easy race for her. And then I think we also had a question about Lindsey Fletcher in Texas, which I think Bridget can answer.
Yep. Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, Texas is a really big House battleground this cycle. So Lindsey Fletcher, for folks who aren't aware, she's in the 7th district in the Houston suburbs. She flipped this seat in 2018, kind of a longtime Republican seat. Here again is where we see that suburban dynamic. Folks who are maybe rejecting President Trump, and these suburbs, particularly in Texas, have been becoming more racially diverse as well, which has also made them more competitive. So Lindsey Fletcher is facing Republican Wesley Hunt, who's an Army veteran. Republicans have been kind of cheering Hunt all cycle as one of their top recruits. He's a dynamic candidate. He's been a really strong fundraiser. But this is a case that I think Democrats are feeling pretty good about where Congresswoman Fletcher is. Republicans still think that Hunt can give her a really competitive race, but this is where the suburban dynamic may come into play here. And Democrats, too, to give a sense of things, are targeting 10 Republican seats in Texas. So they're looking to make gains in Texas, not expecting any losses with either Fletcher or Colin Allred, who's in the Dallas suburbs.
You want to stay in Texas and take the Kenny Marchant seat too? In New York,
sure. Sorry, I haven't seen that question. What is the likelihood of Texas 24 staying red since Kenny Marchant is retiring? Yeah, so this is also in the Dallas suburbs. This is an example of where Republican retirement has opened up a competitive seat. I was actually down in this district back at the end of February, so kind of before everything shut down, which is crazy to think about. So there, Democrat Candace Valenzuela is taking on Beth Van Dyne, former Irving mayor. That race is looking really competitive. There's a lot of outside money pouring into this race and all of the Texas House races. So this is an example of, a district that's changing demographically, that has well-educated folks in the suburbs who may be rejecting President Trump. It sounds like we're repeating ourselves, but it's because there's the same dynamic kind of happening in a lot of these races, especially in Texas. So I think that one's considered pretty much a toss-up at this point. Both parties are just competing really hard there. And I don't know if it's really leaning one way or another.
Kate, we have some questions about Michigan races. We've got Fred Upton, Alyssa Slotkin, Haley Stevens, and the 3rd district, the Justin Amash seat.
Yeah, the 3rd district is really, really interesting to watch, because when Justin Amash said he was not running for re-election, we sort of took that to mean that this will go back to Republicans, because Amash, of course, changed his party affiliation to independent. I think he might be a libertarian now, but he's not a Republican anymore. So it looked like that was going to be a congressional seat that would go back to Republicans. But it's very competitive, and it actually does look like it could go either way. It's again, and Michigan has, we thought, early on in this cycle, we thought people like Alyssa Slotkin, who's a freshman, would be more vulnerable, and it looks like she's not. What was the other district that they? Haley
Stevens and Fred Upton.
Right. So Haley Stevens, another Democrat who looks reasonably safe. So Fred Upton is likely to win re-election, but we wrote about that race not too long ago. more competitive than you might have thought for someone who held that seat for as long as he has. So it is one to watch, but he is, you know, likely to win re-election there.
And the reason I think you're going to see, you're hearing a lot of the themes come out again, is one of the phenomena that we've seen in just the last 3 cycles is that local races have become national races. You can argue about whether it's because local media has declined and the only place people get news about Congress is from watching cable TV at night, and therefore national issues, you know, play a bigger role where it used to be, well, I know my congressman and I like my congressman. One of the things I will say is that one of the things we do on Roll Call, cover Capitol Hill, is we cover congressmen. So I'm sorry we couldn't answer your questions about state legislative races or governor's races. I do know that Nathan Gonzalez, our political analyst, elections analyst, does handicap governor's races. So I can ask him about that in 2 weeks if you want to come back. But we're about over time. And I want to just thank everybody for tuning in, and thank Stephanie and Bridget and Kate for all the work that they do. Our next webinar will be a week from today, and it's going to be Kate and I talking about what you might be able to expect based on different scenarios in control of Congress in the new year. And then Nathan will be back in 2 weeks talking about the way things look at the final weeks of the race, whether that map has expanded or shrunk. So you can log on, you can sign up for those webinars the same way you signed up for these. And you can read all of our coverage on rollcall.com. So thanks for watching.